Welcome, friends, to one of our last life-changing video overviews for English 11. Please, as always, take notes because there will be a quiz. No ambiguity this time. There will definitely be a quiz on which you may use any notes that you take while watching this video. So please pay careful attention. The next literary slash cultural movement we will be reading and studying is known as Modernism. And we're looking at approximately from World War I to the late 20s in the onset of the Great Depression. As you can see in the art world, there were some major changes from the traditional realism, which you can see on the left, to the more experimental and abstract paintings that you see on the right-hand side. And those same differences also appear in literature, as I will explain to you shortly. So just a little bit of historical background. A little pattern that you might be starting to notice is that there are big shifts in worldviews and in culture whenever there's a major war. And in fact, the onset of World War I sounds a lot like the onset of the American Civil War, in that the people involved in and the people volunteering to fight really had no idea what they were getting into and no idea how brutal and horrific that war would be. The Americans kind of knew, because the end of the Civil War was in many ways the trench warfare that World War I was primarily. So no idea what they're getting into. The war turns out to be unimaginably terrible in terms of the casualties and the type of warfare. And also, in the end, what was it really fought for? I mean, what was the purpose of it, other than you had a bunch of alliances, you had an assassination that set off this chain reaction of nations battling each other, and in the end, why? It just left people questioning all of the pillars of Western civilization that had sort of propped us up for centuries. Can we believe our political leaders, our religious leaders, the patriotism and nationalism that led to this horrible war? These are all things that were being questioned. And as you'll see, literature and art reflect the sudden lack of answers for these serious questions. So just briefly, a little bit more about World War I and why it had such lingering effects. As you can see on the right, some of the effects of the trench warfare. In no man's land, the space between the trenches, there's the introduction of poison gas that had just terrible effects on the soldiers who breathed it in the trenches. So there's a reason that the people who survived World War I in that time period were known as the Lost Generation. How do they respond to this conflict that undermined everything that they had maybe once believed? And this is where we get modernism. The artists and the writers who were responding to these dark times during and post World War I, many of them are known as modernists, and I'll explain what exactly that means. So the modernist attitude, not surprisingly, after World War I, reflects that the self is damaged and the world is broken. There's a lot of relativity and uncertainty in their worldview. In literature especially, there's the creation of something called psychological realism, right? So we already looked at realism and how realists wanted to show the world as it is, not how it should be. The modernists, the psychological realists, wanted to go even further than that and try to create art that reflected the way the mind functions. And that can be puzzling, that can be confusing, that can be frightening, but so can the human mind. I'll explain more about that and give some more examples of that soon. There's a fascination with irrationality, primal experiences, and not a lot of humor in these kinds of works, in these modernist works. I mean, there can be irony, and wit. But unlike postmodernism, which is what we'll essentially end the year with, not surprisingly, and hopefully understandably, which comes after modernism. There's quite a bit of humor in postmodernism, but not modernism so much. It's dealing more with, in a serious way, reflecting on how the world is broken. There's a lot of disassociation from the outside world, and the world is portrayed as being collapsed or fragmented. There's a lot of fascination, as I had mentioned earlier, with psychology and some of the darker aspects of that. So there's a little bit of, just a tiny touch of similarity to the Gothics, of the Romanticists, but in a much more experimental and a much more realistic kind of way. Obviously, all those works of Gothic literature are not realistic whatsoever. But like Poe, there's a fascination with the primal, and I mentioned the id when we read Fall of the House of Usher. Because of rapid urbanization, there's also depictions of, and not in a flattering way, cities and city life, and how you can feel alienated and impersonal there. So we see a little bit of that in Gatsby, actually. So some of the forms of modernism that we actually will read, some that delve into these structures. So a lot of times you'll have multiple points of view. Earlier I had that image of Sound and the Fury, and that is famous. One of the best books ever written. But each section, it's broken into 4 sections, is told by a different narrator. The first section is told from an autistic character, and you're not quite sure what they're describing. The second section is told from the point of view of a suicidal character, and so on and so forth. William Faulkner also wrote As I Lay Dying, which again has these multiple narrators that are telling basically the same story but from different points of view. So that's a manifestation of the idea that the self and the world are fragmented. We'll see. Here's just a list of other things you'll see in modernist literature. The main one that I'd like you to pay attention to is stream of consciousness, because we will see examples of this. And stream of consciousness is some people get it quickly. They just understand what is going on in it. For the rest of us, reading stream of consciousness can be a bit of a struggle. But the idea behind stream of consciousness is the writer is trying to recreate the way that the mind works. And the mind jumps from one thing to another, right? Think about it. You sit in my class, and you probably think about 500 different things during those 40 minutes. I might mention something. I might say, mention summer or nature, and then that triggers a memory from last summer when you went on a hike with your family, and then you start thinking about your brother and how he's doing. That's what stream of consciousness is. It's trying to recreate the way that the mind just jumps from one thing to another, is essentially irrational, and to try to convey that psychological realism. The other thing you'll see in modernism, almost on the opposite end of stream of consciousness, is minimalism. So breaking down of not just formal kinds of writing, like especially in poetry, but also the length of poetry. So you'll see things like, William Carlos Williams, great poet from North Jersey, Paterson, New Jersey. His most famous poem, The Red Wheelbarrow, and this is it. This is the entire poem. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. And that's the entire thing. So you're seeing a huge shift from the realists. Even the realists would not have gotten this experimental necessarily. So there's a lot of surface description, but the real meaning and the real thematic importance of whatever it is, the poem or the story, is beneath the surface, and you really have to think about it and engage with it. Ernest Hemingway was awesome at that, so we'll read some of his stories. Modernism is tough. I'm not going to lie to you. We're going to read some really challenging things in class, things that will confuse you, and you just have to be okay with being confused and being okay with, I don't understand what's going on. Be patient with yourself and be patient with the text. Um, uh, up until the modernists, pretty much every writer, novelists at least, treated their readers in a very safe way. Think about a book like Jane Eyre or Pride and Prejudice. In those books, Bronte or Jane Austen is essentially in the first chapter, the first page, taking you by the hand and leading you along safely through this narrative. Okay, modernism is not about that. Modernism is throwing you into the middle of God knows what, and you need to take some time to figure out what the heck is going on. You need to put the pieces together, and that can be challenging, but that can also make it more meaningful. And I should also mention that modernist literature is not without meaning. Okay, postmodernism, when we get to that, there's some intentionally meaningless and self-destructive works that come out of that era. But modernism is not like that. It can be confusing, it can be frustrating, but there is always meaning found in the work. And then last but not least, I just want to mention some important modernists. We're not going to get a chance to read all of these writers, unfortunately. T.S. Eliot wrote The Wasteland and The Hollow Men, some of the defining poetry of modernism. James Joyce, he wrote the book. I may have mentioned it before, Ulysses. It takes place in a single day, guy walking around Dublin. It's based loosely on the Odyssey, but it's like 900 pages. Don't read Ulysses. Read Dubliners. If you take AP next year with Miss Vermont, you guys will read it. It's so good. Virginia Woolf, Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse. Amazing examples of stream of consciousness. William Faulkner, my favorite writer of all time. Sound of the Fury, Absalom, Absalom, As I Lay Dying, Late in August, amazing. Ezra Pound is a famous modernist poet, and Joseph Conrad wrote Heart of Darkness, which the film Apocalypse Now is based upon. Okay, so that is it for our modernist presentation. Again, please make sure that you did take notes, and that way you'll be ready for the quiz. And I think that's it. Good luck, everyone. Take care.